Boldwood presents The Bookseller, written by Valerie Keogh and read by Rose Robinson. Prologue. I adored my father. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with work-calloused hands, his round face perpetually tanned from days outside as a labourer on a building site. On minimum pay, to make a decent income, he needed to work long hours, often 7 days a week. The rare times he was home, he looked down on me and my 2 older siblings with absent-minded affection. And we, or I at any rate, looked up at him as if he were a god. There were times, especially in the long days of summer, when we didn't see him for most of the week. I used to imagine that he'd come to see us as we slept, that he'd bend to brush a hand over our heads, plant a kiss on our foreheads, perhaps even whisper that he loved us. We children never questioned the long hours he worked. If our mother did, we weren't aware. Did he really need to work so hard? Or did he choose to be out in the fresh air with the gruff, cheerful camaraderie of like-minded men, rather than spend time with his house-proud, slightly pernickety wife? She was a quiet, biddable, conscientious woman who prided herself in keeping a clean home and neat, well-behaved children. There wasn't a pinch of steel in her. She'd sway in the softest breeze, in the slightest waft of discontent from our father, or in the smallest sign of misconduct in her offspring. We weren't bad children. At least, my siblings weren't. My older sister and brother, close in age as they were best buddies. They rarely tolerated their bratty baby sister tagging along, and often vanished on some adventure, leaving me forlorn, lonely, and desperate for company. When my father was home, I would look up at this big man, idolize him, almost beg for the merest hint of attention. That's how it started. My mother, unable to discipline us for breaking any of her many rules of good behaviour, would keep note of the slightest infraction and pour them out to her husband when he had time to mete out punishment. Frequently, this was days after the event, when none of us children could remember what we'd done wrong. It didn't matter. My father would use his large, worn hands on us. He would pull my soft, yielding body to him and bring his hand down on my behind. The pain would be intense, as would the pleasure of being held so closely, of having this godlike man's complete, undivided attention. Sometimes, if my crime warranted a more severe punishment, 2 or 3 wallops rather than 1, he would mete it out, then wipe away my tears. He'd hold me in his arms, offer me comfort, and whisper into my ear, "You mustn't be naughty, my little lamb." These were moments of bliss for a child desperate for affection. I became naughtier and sought for more ways to offend. I deliberately broke things, stole from my mother's purse and from the corner shop. I caused trouble at school, pushed my classmates, refused to do the teacher's bidding, answered back. Anything to draw my mother's ire in order to merit the punishment doled out by my father and the pleasure that followed. I was 15 when my father left us. Me. He left me. Not voluntarily, though. Not for him the slow fade into old age and frailty. My big, strong father died in a stupid, careless workplace accident. His death left me bereft. Doubly abandoned when my mother retreated into herself. My siblings, now in their mid-20s, had already left home. Sarah married and living in Bath, Doug living in Glasgow. They came home for a few days for the funeral, then left with promises to return. But they and I knew these were made for form rather than any desire to visit. I desperately missed my father. The feel of his hand across my cheek, or the punch that would send me careering into the wall for some infraction of my mother's increasingly erratic rules. I missed him because his discipline was always followed by words of comfort and love. By the time he died, pleasure and pain were already inextricably linked in my head. Chapter 1. Helen twisted under the duvet as the dream came, in full colour and stereo sound, as it usually did. The snap of the leather belt before Toby held it taut between his hands, face set, mouth a narrow slash, grey eyes sparkling flint. She held her breath and waited for the sound of the leather cutting through the air, that distinctive swish that always preceded a bolt of pain. She braced herself, but made no attempt to dodge out of the way. Why would she? When neither the sound nor the pain arrived, she opened her eyes to look at the man who insisted he loved her, the man she loved in return, and saw that something had changed. He'd never make a poker player. Every emotion was written clearly on his face. And sometime in the preceding days or weeks, or had it been months, his love had soured. There was something different in his eyes, something new. She wasn't sure, but she thought it might have been disgust. She remembered her fingers closing around the handle of the knife. It was in her hand when she rang for an ambulance, still there when the police first hammered on, then burst through her front door. "Drop the weapon!" someone had shouted, repeating it louder as if she was deaf. She'd looked at it, confused. Weapon? It was a kitchen knife, one she'd only bought the previous day. An incredibly sharp one. She'd already nicked her finger with it. It had bled profusely, but not enough to cover the knife in blood as it was now, dripping from the edge, her hand covered in it, the cloying scent drifting up to make her gag. "Drop the weapon." More than one voice now, loud and insistent. Finally, she did as she was told and released her grip, opening her fingers to allow the knife to drop to the ground. The point of the knife missed her bare foot by a hair's width and embedded itself into the wooden floor. She couldn't remember if she'd screamed then, or if she'd looked down at Toby's cooling body, pleased to see his expression had changed, his mouth twisted in disbelief rather than disgust. Pleased that the bastard would never be able to hit her again. The police refused to allow her to wash before they took her away. She sat in the back of their car with her bloody hands resting in her lap, where they stained the thin fabric of the cream dress she wore. In the station, they took photographs. They even took swabs, which she thought was a waste of taxpayers' money. She wasn't denying it was Toby's blood. How could she, when they'd found her with the knife in her hand? The very knife she must have driven into his belly with as much force as she could manage. Had she found it easier than she'd expected? She didn't know. Her memory of that day had a gap between when she picked up the knife and when she saw Toby collapse at her feet with a ridiculous look of surprise on his face. She'd watched the blood gurgle up from the wound in his belly for a long time before she associated it with the knife in her hand. In the 2 years she'd spent in prison, she'd had the dream almost every night. She considered it a part of her sentence. Perhaps she had been foolish to believe it would eventually stop, that once she was released on license, half free as that might be, she could start looking to the future. The counsellor she'd seen as part of her rehabilitation said the dreams were caused by subconscious guilt. "You have to learn to forgive yourself," she'd said. "Negative thoughts are detrimental to your well-being." The counsellor always spoke in sound bites, as if waiting for someone to quote her. Helen had thought she was full of crap, but the sessions, although not mandatory, were a welcome diversion from the grueling boredom of prison life. During one session, she'd given the counsellor an edited version of her childhood, telling her about her siblings, not her parents, about the words that still rang in her head. "Stupid baby," Noisy brat. My sister was 10 years older than me. I still hear her sometimes, telling me I'm a nuisance. Echoes from your past, the counsellor had said, nodding as if this was perfectly normal. What I'd like you to do, when you hear this voice in your head, is to imagine writing whatever she says on a piece of paper, then tie it to the bottom of an imaginary helium balloon and release it. As it floats away, see your negative thoughts going with it. The next time the voice had sounded in Helen's head, she did as the counsellor had suggested. But as the balloon was floating away, taking all those horrible words with it, her sister came dashing up with a knife in one hand and burst it. The ensuing bang made Helen cry and gulp, and her mouth fill with blood that had exploded from the pretty yellow balloon. It was a dream. Helen woke in her prison cell, a film of sweat over her body, the echo of her scream still floating in the air, her cellmate glaring at her, and the certain conviction that the counsellor hadn't a clue what she was talking about. Of course, Helen hadn't been able to tell her everything. If she had, if the counsellor had known the truth, the sessions would no longer have been an optional extra. They'd have been compulsory. And the poor deluded counsellor might even have suggested that Helen needed psychiatric help. If they knew the truth, all of it, her sentence would have been far longer than 4 years. So, Helen kept her secret, and if the payment for keeping it was to be continuously reminded of what she'd done, well, that was her penance. Chapter 2. After 2 years in prison, Helen was released to spend the remainder of her sentence on license. Free but tethered by conditions she had to live by, with a community offender manager appointed to ensure she did. It did mean, though, that she was entitled to pick up the tattered strings of her previous life. The civil service job where she'd worked for 10 years was waiting for her. She'd have gone back to it, would have had to, except for the sadly fortuitous death of her mother the previous year. Her mother's will, like her home, had been neat and tidy without any trimmings. Everything was to be divided equally between her 3 children. It didn't make Helen rich, but suddenly a dream she'd had forever, one of owning a second-hand bookshop, was made possible. The last few years, the 2 in prison, the one before, had been a struggle. Books, her escape as a child, proved to be just as effective when she'd been stuck behind prison walls. In an odd way, she'd benefited from the limited supply available. It meant she read whatever she could lay her hands on, reading genres she'd never thought would appeal. Steampunk, science fiction, biographies, memoirs. It had broadened her taste, one way of turning what had been a horrendous, life-changing period of her life to a good advantage. During the 2nd year of her incarceration, it was one of the things that had kept her sane. The other, after her mother passed away, was spending her limited internet access scouring the estate agents for suitable properties in Bath to house her bookshop. She intended to be sensible and pay off the mortgage on her home first, but it still left a very healthy £400,000 to work with. Her sister Sarah, who'd visited regularly since her imprisonment, was the first to be told her plans. "I'm going to open a second-hand bookshop." Helen watched her face as she took in the news. If Sarah thought it was a crazy idea, it wouldn't have changed her mind, but the sisters had grown close in the last year, and she wanted her on her side. For many years, Helen had harboured resentment for the way her older siblings had excluded her when they were children. The 10-year age gap between the sisters, which had seemed to be an uncrossable divide when one was 5 and the other 15, didn't seem to lessen when one was 30 and the other 40. But when Helen's world imploded, Sarah was there, and her unconditional support during the trial and since had brought the two together. "A bookshop? You'll be in your element," Sarah had said. "I think it's a brilliant idea. It'll be a bit like living between the covers of a book." That's the way Helen saw it. It's the way she wanted to see it. By the time she was released, she'd looked at hundreds of properties, but they were either in the wrong place or priced way above her means, or simply not the shop of her dreams. "You'll find something," Sarah said. "It's just going to take time." Helen didn't want to wait. Her future was there, just out of reach. She wanted to grab it, hold on to it tightly, and fly with it. She stared at the road ahead as Sarah drove her home on her first day of freedom. "I'm so tempted to do a Mel Gibson." Sarah glanced at her. "What?" "You know, like in that movie Braveheart when he shouted, 'Freedom!' If I remember rightly, he died straight after." Helen shrugged and returned to staring at the road ahead. "I'd better not tempt fate, then." They were at the turn-off to the road where she lived, waiting for a break to cut across the traffic, when she saw something ahead. "Look," she said. "There's a for sale sign." Sarah didn't need to be told twice and indicated to pull back into the traffic, then immediately signalled to pull into the side of the road and park. The for sale sign was affixed to the front of a rather shabby, down-at-heel building. "It used to be an electrical repair shop," Helen said, peering out of the car window. "Although I've never been inside." She pointed to the neighbouring building. "That pizzeria has been there forever. I used to get takeaways from it." "What do you want to do?" "Get out and have a closer look. Hang on, I won't be a sec." She pushed open the door and climbed out, her eyes fixed on the building. There wasn't much to see. It had obviously been on the market for a while. Weeds had lodged in the cracks between the building and the footpath. The bay window and the glass panels on the front door were boarded up, preventing any opportunity to see the interior. She stepped back to examine what she could. It needed a lot of work. The window frames looked as if they needed to be replaced. A gutter was leaning at an alarming angle. She'd bet the roof would need to be repaired too. When she sat back in the car, Sarah's assessment was clearer. "It looks like a right dump." "Perhaps." But Helen's head was spinning. Stupidly, she hadn't considered this area, but wasn't it the perfect place for a bookshop? Although the road was a busy one, there was plenty of parking. The surrounding area was a mix of residential and businesses, so the footfall past the shop would be good. No harm in having a look online when we get home, see how much they're looking for. Sarah was busy trying to do a U-turn, so it was a few minutes before she could reply. "You're not seriously thinking about it, are you? Honestly, it looks like it would be a total money pit." A short while later, they were parked outside Helen's end of terrace house. She could feel herself tearing up as she looked at it. Home. Was there ever a more beautiful word? Pulling a tissue from her pocket, she wiped her eyes before turning to Sarah. "Thanks again for having looked after it the last couple of years, and for keeping the car ticking over." "No problem. I popped in yesterday and stocked your fridge up with a few things too, so you don't need to rush out to the shops." It's good to be home. It was, but it was also the first time Helen had been there since Toby's death. The place had been cleaned by specialists. Sarah had been clear about that. But Helen still had to face where it had happened, where her life had changed. Sarah must have understood, because her normally chatty sister was silent as Helen opened the front door and stepped inside. She dropped her hold-all on the bottom step of the stair, then, without a word, walked the few steps to the kitchen door and opened it. She didn't move forward, not even when Sarah put a hand on her shoulder and said, "You okay?" If they had put white tape on the floor marking where Toby's body had lain, it couldn't have been any clearer to Helen. She could almost feel the cold handle of the knife in her hand, could almost smell a metallic whiff in the air. Worse, she could hear Toby's voice. "You know you want it. You love it, don't you?" The crack of the belt as he snapped it, the swish of leather through the air. The pain. "Helen?" Sarah's voice, more urgent now. "I'm fine, it's just..." Helen reached for her sister's hand and squeezed it. "You don't need to explain. When I think of what that bastard put you through, honestly, I wish he was alive so I could kill him myself." It made Helen laugh and relieved the tension that had mounted as soon as she'd opened the front door. Killing someone isn't that easy to do, you know. It takes a special frame of mind. One that had been warped in her childhood and irreparably twisted in the years since. She caught her sister's concerned glance and smiled. "Perhaps it's too soon to make jokes about it. Let's have a cup of tea to celebrate my release. I bought biscuits." Tea and biscuits. The perfect celebration. When they were sitting at the small kitchen table, Helen dipped a biscuit into her mug of tea and popped it whole into her mouth, then pointed to the mobile Sarah had left on the table. "Have a look to see how much they're asking for that place." "You're not seriously thinking about it, are you?" Helen stared into her tea. "I've been looking almost a year. I haven't seen anything in my price range that's suitable." Sarah reached into her handbag. "Here," she said, taking out a mobile phone. "I thought you'd need a new one when you got out. Things have changed a lot in 2 years. Now you can have a look for yourself." Tears filled Helen's eyes again. "I can't seem to stop crying today," she said, picking it up. "This was so kind of you, thank you." "You're allowed to be emotional. It's a new start for you." Sarah nodded towards the mobile and smiled. "I was going to make today's date the password, but I thought the year you were born would be easier." Helen had always been good with technology, so it didn't take her long to figure out how to use it. A few minutes later, she sat back with a sigh. "This is very neat, very clever. Right, now let's find out about that shop." She'd taken note of the estate agent's name and was soon checking their website. "Here it is," she said, unable to keep excitement from seeping into her words. 2 rooms and a kitchen on the ground floor. 3 rooms and a bathroom upstairs. Are there photos? Only one of the outside. None inside. Ha! Helen looked up from the phone. What? No photos inside because the place is a dump, just as I guessed. They don't want to put people off by showing how bad it is. They want to get you there and hope to persuade you. Helen scrolled through the details. It's in the perfect location. The size is just what I was hoping for. You're right, though. It says it needs total refurbishment. She put the phone down. It's been empty for 2 years, but it's still priced way above what I could afford considering it needs work. Yes, if it needs a total refurb, you're talking a lot of dosh. It's what I said, a money pit. Yes, Helen said, dragging the word out. What's going on in that head of yours? I can almost see the cogs turning. I was just thinking of the coincidence. It's been empty for 2 years. So is my life. Maybe it's a sign. She half expected the reaction to be a laugh or some scathing remark. Instead, Sarah poured the last of the tea into her cup and sat back. Why don't you go and have a look at it? When you see inside, you'll realise it's totally unsuitable, and then you can put it out of your head. It's just... Helen hunched up her shoulders. I want to get on with it, you know? Take control of my future. Get the shop, fill it with books, start this new chapter of my life. She let her shoulders drop. A cliché, but Doesn't it fit? Sarah reached for Helen's hand and squeezed it. It does. And it will work out for you eventually. I don't think this place is the right one for you, but why don't we go and have a look at it? Rule it out, get it out of your system, then I'll help you look elsewhere. There didn't seem to be any point in reminding Sarah that Helen had been looking for a year and knew what she wanted. When she shut her eyes, she could see it as clearly as her reflection in a mirror. There'd be high ceilings, wooden shelving on every wall stacked tightly with books, a staircase to an upper floor, preferably a cast-iron spiral one, but she would settle for a simple stairway. There'd be old, worn leather chairs for customers to sit in, wooden tables and old lamps. An oak desk, scarred by life and time, for her to sit behind. Every detail was carefully drawn in full colour in her head. And in those long days locked away, she'd even designed a logo to go with it. With a surname like Appleby, it wasn't hard. An apple, with a cartoon bee sitting on top reading a book. Twee, perhaps, but it would make people smile. She'd have a stamp made, and every book in her shop would have the Appleby logo. Her past, all of it, would be just that. Wouldn't it? The prison counsellor had advised her to forget the past and think of the future. What did she know about anything? Helen had crossed a line by killing Toby. On this side of it, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. A victim? A murderer? An ex-con? A pathetic fool. What do you think? Helen looked at her sister, confused. About? Then she shook her head. Sorry, the shop. Yes. Why not? It won't do any harm to have a look. It's like when you see a dress in a shop window. You fancy it, but don't have time to go in to try it on. It sticks in your head, becoming the most perfect dress ever, until you give in and go back to try it on, and you hate it. But then it's out of your head. It'll be like that? Exactly, Sarah said, giving her arm a gentle nudge. But it wasn't. Chapter 3. Sarah insisted on staying over that first night Helen was out of prison. Just to keep you company. Helen didn't think it was necessary. She wasn't a child. But when they'd both gone to bed, when silence fell on the house and all she could hear was her breath, she was grateful there was someone on the other side of the bedroom wall. Not that she was going to call out, or, God forbid, go into her sister's room and ask if she could sleep with her. After all, she'd done that as a child and it had got her nowhere. It wasn't that she missed the continuous rumble of sound that she'd got used to over the last 2 years. It was that in that ever-present noise, the sounds from her life before were better concealed. And now, in the silence of the home she'd shared with Toby, they were back. His voice, hers, loud and shrill, harsh and angry. They started quietly, increasing in volume to a crescendo, fading away to a sibilant whisper. Sarah had asked many months before if Helen had considered selling up and moving elsewhere for a fresh start, as if she'd find it uncomfortable moving back into a house where someone had died, where someone had been murdered. The tiny voice inside her head corrected her. Where she had murdered her partner. Earlier, in the kitchen, she'd stepped over the space where he'd lain, lifting each foot high enough to clear his body. If Sarah had noticed, and she must have done, she'd said nothing. Perhaps it would be sensible to sell and move elsewhere, but Helen had fallen in love with the late Victorian house the first time she'd viewed it. She'd stretched herself financially to buy it and had done renovations over the years as money had allowed. Although perfect for one, it had proved to be slightly too small for two. Had that been part of the problem? Had the 6-foot Toby simply taken up too much space? Annoyingly, he still was. Was this his revenge for what she'd done? to haunt the home she loved. Helen linked her hands behind her head and stared at the ceiling. She'd left the curtains open, but the nearest streetlight was quite a distance along the road outside. It barely impacted on the darkness of the room and did nothing to dispel the shadows in the corners. She could sell up and move elsewhere, but what would be the point? The shadows would always be there. The prison counsellor had advised her not to dwell on the past, and she tried not to. But the bastard kept insisting on tagging along for the ride. She tried to concentrate on the future. As soon as she and Sarah had made the decision to view the dilapidated house, Helen had rung the estate agent and made an appointment for the following morning. This morning, she realised looking at the bedside clock, the 12:02 teasing her. She thought about going downstairs for a cup of tea, but alone in the dark, she couldn't face opening the kitchen door. It was foolish. Toby wasn't there. He couldn't hurt her again. But that was part of it, wasn't it? Being back here, in this bed they'd shared, she could finally admit that she didn't miss him. She missed the pain. Chapter 4. The following morning after breakfast, rather than driving, Helen and Sarah walked the 10 minutes to the property. They were standing staring at the frontage when a car pulled up and a harried-looking man stepped out. He saw them, pinned on a smile, and extended a hand as he approached.
Miss Appleby?
Yes. She shook his hand and indicated her sister with a jerk of her head. And this is my sister, Sarah Drew.
Nice to meet you both,
he said, giving Sarah's hand a quick shake.
My name is Giles Lambert. I'm the agent for this exciting premises.
Exciting premises, Sarah muttered into Helen's ear as the estate agent pulled out a huge set of keys and searched through them for the appropriate one. Inserting it into the lock, he jiggled it for an age before it finally turned, and he pushed the door open.
It's been empty for a little over 2 years,
he said, standing back to allow Helen and Sarah to enter.
It was a small electric appliance repair shop. The owner ran it for almost 2 decades.
He sniffed and looked around, shaking his head.
I don't think he spent much on repairs even when he was here, and there's been nothing done, as you can see, in the years since.
He wasn't making much of an effort to sell the place, but he didn't need to. Even in the poor light coming around the edges of the boarded-up windows, there was something about the spacious room with its high ceilings that immediately appealed to Helen. When the estate agent flicked a switch, the room's grandeur was slightly dimmed by the rotting window frame, the damp patch on one wall, the underlying stink of decay. Ignoring the negatives, Helen concentrated on the high ceiling and the space, her imagination already at work to transform it into the picture she'd had in her head for so long, the details etched during sleepless nights and long, monotonous days. She followed a beam of light to an even larger room at the back of the shop, with windows overlooking a tangle of greenery that at one stage had probably been a pretty garden. Helen peered through the dirty glass, trying to make out the extent of it without venturing outside to be attacked by brambles. Big enough, she thought. As she leaned forward, her fingers sank into the rotten wood of the windowsill. She ran an eye around the frame. It too was in bad condition.
There's a pantry kitchen too,
the estate agent said from behind her, jerking a thumb towards a door.
It's in need of a refit.
I'm surprised the place hasn't fallen down. Sarah opened the door to the kitchen and screwed up her nose. A refit? It needs to be gutted. It stinks of mouse droppings too. Helen brushed crumbled wood from her hands and crossed to peer over her sister's shoulder. The one window in the small room had been boarded up, and what little light there was drifting through the doorway where they stood. Although Helen was searching for something positive to say, There was nothing to be said in favour of the mismatched cupboards with their doors either missing or hanging askew. Nor could she come up with anything nice to say about the ancient cooker that stood at the far end of the narrow space, almost completely blocking the back door. The grease and grime of decades had changed its original colour to a sickly beige. A row of dials near the top reflected what little light there was. It made the cooker look bizarrely demonic. "You okay?" Sarah asked when Helen shivered. She shook her head to dispel the macabre image of the filthy old cooker staring straight at her, as if welcoming her into its space. Silly, stupid nonsense. "It's the thought of the mice," she said, nudging her sister's arm. "Shut the door before they come to investigate the intruders." Sarah hurriedly slammed it shut and took a step backwards. "This place should be condemned." She darted a disbelieving look at the estate agent. "You're seriously asking $400K for this?" He shrugged. "Structurally, it's sound. It's in a good area and could, with a bit of imagination, be converted into a nice family home." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "A family home? Did you see the traffic on that road outside? That's the Upper Bristol Road. It's always busy. You wouldn't be able to open your door without breathing in car fumes." Ignoring them, Helen went back into the front room from where a stairway headed upward. The landing window, layered in years of grime, threw a soft focused light that hid more than it showed. She stepped gingerly onto the first step. It squeaked noisily, but seemed safe. The landing window, although dirty, hadn't gone the way of its downstairs relations and seemed solid. In fact, with a bit of prodding, she discovered that all the windows upstairs were in good shape. 2 of the 3 bedrooms, with the same high ceilings she'd admired below, were each a good size, the third much smaller. The bathroom was also a decent space. "Bloody hell, it stinks in here." Sarah stood in the open doorway, her face screwed up in disgust. She pinched her nose with her thumb and first finger and spoke with a resultant nasal twang. "Can we get out of here now?" "In a minute." Helen shut the door and headed back into the front bedroom. She tapped on the dividing wall. "It'd be easy to take this down, make this and the back bedroom into one big space. I'd leave the smaller one to use as an office or storage." When there was no comment, she turned to see her sister's appalled face, mouth opening and closing as if she simply couldn't find the words. "Look past all the mess," Helen said. "The rooms are big, the ceiling's high, there's plenty of light." She tapped her hand on the wall again. "With this gone, it would be amazing." Her eyes sparkled as she waved a hand around. "Imagine all the walls lined with bookshelves." Another wave of her hand, lower down. "Maybe hip-high standalone shelves in the middle." She frowned as she considered the logistics. "Maybe on wheels, so we could move them out of the way to hold book talks or for book clubs, etc." "You're serious?" Helen was. Creepy cooker aside, it was exactly what she'd been looking for. "It's perfect. There's free parking outside so people can park and come in. Student accommodation for Bath Spa University isn't far away. I could hand out flyers, advertise in university magazines. Plus, there'd be passing trade from people who live around here." Brushing past her silent sister, she returned to the ground floor where the agent stood, hands in his trouser pockets, boredom in the tight line of his mouth. He looked resigned rather than hopeful as Helen joined him. "Seen enough?" "It's been on the market over 2 years, hasn't it?" He shrugged. 25 months. "And you've had no offers?" He straightened suddenly, as if smelling potential in her interest. "Not correct. We did have one, but it fell through." He waved a hand around. "It could be a little gold mine, this, if it was done upright." "Why did the sale collapse then?" She could see the wheels in his brain turning as he wondered if the truth or a lie would be of more benefit. An issue with planning permission, I'd say, she said. It was a complete stab in the dark, but she was guessing only an investor would be interested in purchasing such a run-down property. The agent shrugged again. You're right. He wanted to convert it into 3 apartments but couldn't get planning permission for more than 2. He said it wouldn't be financially viable, so pulled out. And no offers since? She smiled. So, would the owner be agreeable to drop the price for a quick sale? Sarah's jaw dropped. Are you crazy? Subject to a survey, of course. Helen might be a little crazy, but she wasn't stupid. Her funds were limited. Cosmetically, the place was a dump, but that could be fixed. If it was structurally unsound, it would be the money pit her sister had warned about. I'm sure they'd entertain any reasonable offer, the agent said, his whole demeanour changing at the thought of a sale. He tilted his head in question and waited. It needs new windows, there's damp, the kitchen and bathroom need to be gutted. It's going to take quite a bit to get it into shape, so I'm thinking 300,000 is a much more suitable price to pay. Helen watched his face carefully, relieved to see he didn't immediately shake his head. It was a low offer. She might get lucky. Let me see if I can get the owner on the phone, the agent said, reaching for his mobile and heading outside, shutting the door behind him. Immediately, Sarah turned to her. Are you absolutely barking mad? If I can get it at a good price, if you got it free, it'd still be too expensive. New windows, bathroom, and a small kitchen. And the damp! Sarah pointed to the ominous dark stain down one wall. Probably a leaking pipe, said as if Helen knew what she was talking about, not as someone desperate. And she was. This place was perfectly placed, the ideal size. She could make it work. She could put the past behind her and be happy. She wanted happy, had been searching for it for too long. She'd traded pain for it. But then, wasn't it always the way? Happiness had a price. It came down to what she was willing to pay to have it. She'd paid with part of herself for too long. But the woman on this side of that line she'd crossed by killing Toby wasn't going to pay that way any longer. A run-down dump of a house, a wrecked mess of a life. She was going to fix both. Chapter 5. It took a lot of toing and froing, nail-biting, floor-pacing, checking mobile reception, and a million doubts about whether Helen was doing the right thing or not, before an agreement was reached. The vendor came down to $350. She came up to $325. An agreement was finally reached late that evening at $340. 340,000! Sarah opened the bottle of wine she'd insisted on buying to celebrate Helen's new venture. I hope you know what you're doing. So did Helen. After I've paid off the mortgage on this place, I'll still have 30 grand left from the money Mum left me. It's not a lot, but if the place is structurally sound, I should be okay. She gave her sister a gentle thump. You and Devon will help, won't you? I can hire a skip and we can haul everything out, see what's what. Of course we'll help. Devon's mate Ivan works for a kitchen installation company. I bet he'd be able to get you something at a knockdown price. He might be able to install it too. The kitchen was the least of her worries, but Helen wasn't going to look a pretty gift horse in the mouth. If she was lucky, her brother-in-law might rope his mates in to do more than install the kitchen. I don't suppose he knows someone who does windows, does he? Sarah seesawed a hand. He knows lots of guys. Some are decidedly dodgy, but some are sound. I'll get him to ask around. She took a sip from her glass before continuing. You are going to get a survey done, aren't you? It's not worth skipping that essential step. As if Helen was stupid. She hid the irritation in the wine glass she held to her lips without drinking. Her tolerance for alcohol had dropped after her 2-year abstinence, and it wasn't wise to get drunk. She might say things she shouldn't to the sister she needed. Say stupid things, not do them. She couldn't give that as an excuse for what she'd done. She'd been stone-cold sober when she'd killed Toby. Of course I'm getting a survey done. I was lucky. The 5th person I rang had just had a cancellation. Otherwise, I could have been waiting for a few weeks. He's coming tomorrow. Until he says it's structurally sound, there's no point in planning anything. But she was. In her head, as she'd been doing for months. No, not months. She'd been planning this bookshop all her life. For as long as she could remember, she was happiest between the pages of a book. It was a happiness that came with no demands, no promises, no pain. And if a book disappointed, as happened, there was always another to pick up, another adventure waiting. Now, they were offering her a future, and she had to grab it. Helen? She dredged up a smile. Sorry, what were you saying? I was asking if you need to let your comm know. Helen's smile became fixed. Her sister appeared to think the acronym was better than the full title. Community Offender Manager. As if COM sounded cute and cuddly. It didn't. Neither did Parole Officer, to use the more common title. Or Supervisor, which was, to Helen, the least offensive. The conditions of her release on license were fairly straightforward. Basically, she had to stay out of trouble, not go anywhere without telling the supervisor, stay in contact with her, tell her if she changed her phone number or email. Tell her everything. This last wasn't a condition, but it seemed safer to assume it was. Safer to assume that this woman, Moira Manson, who already knew so much about her, was entitled to know the rest. Helen had no intention of inadvertently breaking the rules and being recalled to prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. I'll do it now, Helen said, taking out her phone. She emailed Moira with the details of the property she intended to purchase and the business she hoped to start. It's best to tell her everything, she said, putting the phone down. She shouldn't be surprised. I've already told her this was my plan. She remembered explaining that she and her siblings had been left a considerable amount of money when their mother died, and she'd hoped to make her dream of opening a bookshop come true. She'd been surprised by Moira's reaction, a laugh of derision followed by a snort of disbelief. Helen wasn't certain, but she thought she'd also seen a sliver of envy flit across her face. Putting the woman out of her head, Helen's thoughts turned back to her plans for the shop. It would depend on the results of the survey. With only £30,000 to play with, any structural repairs would put the premises out of her reach. Then she'd have to begin her search again, putting her life on hold once more. That new future she yearned for. A chance to put the past behind her. The thought made her give a weary sigh. Sarah reached across and grabbed her hand. It's shocking that you have to live under these license conditions for 2 more years. I blame that useless blasted solicitor you had. He should have insisted they dismiss the charges against you. Dismiss the charges? Helen gave a soft laugh. A bit hard to do that. After all, I did kill Toby, remember? His family and their solicitor wanted me tried for murder. It was only thanks to my solicitor that it was reduced to involuntary manslaughter. And thanks to his argument that there were mitigating circumstances, my sentence was only 4 years and not longer. You were defending yourself. It was an argument the sisters had had time and time again. Helen had been grateful to be sentenced to only 4 years. Sarah incandescent with anger that she was serving any time at all. I don't think I'll ever forget the photos of your injuries. The welts across your back. The bruises. She squeezed the hand she still held. I still can't believe you put up with it for so long. He was so good to me, you know. Helen's eyes filled. The first few months he was gentle, kind, considerate. I thought I'd fallen on my feet. She pulled her hand away from Sarah's, reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a tatty tissue to dry her eyes. You know, my track record with men was pretty crap. Toby seemed to be the answer to all my prayers. He certainly put on a good show. And Devon liked him. Not that that's saying much. My idiot husband likes everyone. He's the most ridiculously undiscerning creature. She hesitated. I haven't liked to ask before, but when did it all start going wrong? It was a question Helen had been asked by so many people. The police, the doctors who'd examined her injuries, her solicitor. But it wasn't something she'd been able to answer.